The morning sun painted the precinct in hues of gold, but the air inside was anything but warm. Officer Daniels was in no mood to deal with yet another complaint. To him, it was just another day on the job, dealing with what he liked to call ungrateful citizens. The old officer, hardened by years of patrolling the streets, had built himself a reputation, not one of honor or respect, but one of arrogance and a sharp temper. At the station's front desk, a woman stood quietly, her presence commanding attention without effort. She wasn't tall, but there was something about her, a quiet confidence and unshakable poise. She wore a crisp, tailored suit, the kind that made you wonder if she was a lawyer or someone important. Her calm demeanor contrasted starkly with the chaos around her. Daniels barely looked up as she spoke. "I'm here to discuss." "Hold on, ma'am," he interrupted sharply, raising a dismissive hand. "I don't have time for complaints right now." The woman didn't flinch. She simply waited, her gaze steady. Minutes passed, and Daniels finally looked up, annoyed. "All right, what is it now?" he snapped, standing up and towering over her. "I'd like to speak to someone in charge," she said, her voice cool but firm. Daniels laughed, the kind of laugh that wasn't meant to be kind. "Lady, I am in charge here." He leaned in slightly, his expression smug. "And I've had about enough of people like you walking in here thinking you can tell me how to do my job." The room seemed to freeze for a moment as Daniels' words hung in the air. Then it happened. Daniels, clearly irritated and wanting to assert his authority, did the unthinkable. He spat. Right there, in the middle of the precinct, in front of officers and staff, he spat at the woman standing before him. Gasps echoed across the room. Eyes darted between Daniels and the woman, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. For a moment, she stood there, still as a statue. The only sign of her reaction was the faint narrowing of her eyes. Then, calmly and deliberately, she pulled out a small badge from her pocket and placed it on the desk in front of Daniels. The badge glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights, its golden insignia unmistakable. "I believe you'll find," she said slowly, her voice steady but laced with steel, "that I'm the one actually in charge here." Daniels stared at the badge, his face draining of color as the realization hit him like a freight train. The murmurs around the room grew louder, officers whispering to each other in disbelief. The woman stepped forward, her eyes locked on Daniels. "You can call me Chief," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Chief Daniels." And just like that, the room erupted, not in cheers or applause, but in the kind of shocked silence that spoke volumes. Daniels stumbled back, words failing him for the first time in his career. What would happen next? Well, that's a story you'll want to stick around for. The silence in the room was deafening. All eyes were fixed on Chief Daniels as she stood her ground, the weight of her authority radiating through the precinct. Officer Daniels, now visibly shaken, opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The confidence he wore like armor moments ago had completely vanished, replaced by the unmistakable sting of humiliation. Chief Daniels picked up the badge she'd placed on the desk, tucking it back into her pocket with a calm that only made the tension in the room feel heavier. "Officer Daniels," she said evenly, her gaze locked on his, "step into my office. Now." The room seemed to exhale all at once as murmurs rippled through the gathered officers and staff. Nobody dared to make eye contact with the chief as she turned and walked toward her office at the far end of the precinct. She didn't need to look back. She knew Daniels was trailing behind, though his steps were far less certain. Once inside, she closed the door softly behind him and motioned for him to sit. He hesitated, but her expression left no room for argument. He sank into the chair, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. Chief Daniels remained standing, her posture straight and unwavering. She took a moment to survey the room, her eyes landing on the framed photographs of past precinct leaders on the wall. It wasn't lost on her that none of them looked like her. "Do you know why I'm here, Officer Daniels?" she asked finally, breaking the heavy silence. He glanced up at her, his face pale. I didn't know," he stammered, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't know you were." "The chief," she finished for him. Her voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. "No, you didn't, and that's exactly the problem." Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding her gaze. He knew better than to speak out of turn, but the weight of her words made his stomach churn. "I took this position because this precinct needed change," Chief Daniels continued, her tone measured. "I've spent my entire career fighting for accountability and respect, for the community, for the people we serve, and for the officers who wear this badge with honor. What I saw out there just now," she paused, letting the words hang, "that was the opposite of everything this uniform stands for." Daniels swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to defend himself, to explain away his behavior, but he knew there was no excuse. Not this time. The chief stepped closer, her voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. Do you even realize what you've done? The message you've sent, not just to me, but to every single person who works here, who steps into this building hoping to find justice or help. Daniels opened his mouth, but she raised a hand, silencing him. I don't need an explanation, she said firmly. What I need is for you to think long and hard about what it means to wear this badge, because right now I'm not sure you deserve it. Her words struck like a hammer, and Daniels sank lower in his seat, his face a mixture of shame and regret. Outside the office, the precinct buzzed with quiet chatter. The officers who had witnessed the earlier scene were exchanging glances, their curiosity and unease evident. Nobody could remember the last time the station had felt so tense, so charged. Among them was Officer Maria Lopez, a rookie who had joined the force just a few months ago. She'd heard rumors about Chief Daniels before her arrival, a trailblazer, a no-nonsense leader with a reputation for rooting out corruption and misconduct. But seeing her in action was something else entirely. Lopez leaned closer to her partner, Officer Harris, who was scrolling through his phone with a furrowed brow. Do you think she's gonna fire him? She whispered. Harris shrugged but didn't look up. If she doesn't, I'll be surprised. What he did was way out of line, and to her of all people. Man, that's a career ender. Lopez nodded, her thoughts racing. Part of her was stunned by what she'd witnessed, but another part felt a spark of admiration for the chief. It wasn't every day you saw someone stand up to the old guard like that, especially in a place where power dynamics were so deeply ingrained. Meanwhile, in the office, Chief Daniels leaned against the edge of her desk, her arms crossed. She let the silence stretch for a moment, her piercing gaze never leaving Daniels. I want you to think about what happens next, she said finally. Not just for you, but for this precinct. For the community we serve, every action we take has consequences, Officer Daniels. And it's about time we start remembering that. With that, she stood and walked to the door, opening it with a swift motion. You're dismissed, she said, her voice firm but not unkind. Daniels hesitated for a moment, then rose and walked out of the office, his shoulders slumped. As he made his way back to his desk, the whispers around him grew louder, but he didn't dare look up. Chief Daniels watched him go, her expression unreadable. She knew this was just the beginning. The work ahead would be difficult, and not everyone would welcome the changes she planned to make. But that was exactly why she was here, to challenge the status quo, to rebuild trust, and to ensure that the badge meant something more than just authority. As the door closed behind Daniels, Chief Daniels sat down at her desk, her mind already racing with the challenges she would face. She knew this moment would send shockwaves through the precinct and beyond. But for her, this was more than just a job. It was a mission, a chance to set things right, no matter how difficult the path ahead might be. And for the officers outside, the day was far from over. Whispers of what had happened would spread quickly, fueling both curiosity and tension. Questions would arise, alliances would be tested, and the cracks in the system would begin to show. But one thing was certain, nothing in this precinct would ever be the same again. The precinct was a hive of subdued energy after the confrontation between Chief Daniels and Officer Daniels. Conversations flowed in hushed tones, glances darted toward the chief's office, and the tension felt almost tangible. Officers who had once felt untouchable began to question the stability of their positions. For some, it was unsettling. For others, it was a long-overdue reckoning. Officer Maria Lopez couldn't shake the image of Chief Daniels standing firm, her presence commanding respect even in the face of blatant disrespect. As a new officer, Lopez had often felt like an outsider, trying to navigate a system that didn't always make sense, where the rules seemed to bend for those who had been around the longest. Seeing someone like Chief Daniels, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the norms, felt like a spark of hope. Meanwhile, in another corner of the precinct, Officer Harris leaned against the water cooler, shaking his head as he recounted the morning's events to Detective Wallace. I'm telling you, I've never seen Daniels look so small, Harris said, chuckling. The guy's been throwing his weight around here for years, and now one mistake, and it all came crashing down. Detective Wallace, an older officer with a reputation for keeping his head down, wasn't as amused. It's not just about him, he said quietly. This is going to change everything around here. You think she's going to stop at Daniels? No way, she's here to clean house. Harris shrugged. Maybe it's about time, he muttered, though his tone was less certain. In her office, Chief Daniels was reviewing personnel files, each one a puzzle piece in the larger picture she was trying to assemble. The precinct's culture had been shaped over decades, and she knew it wouldn't change overnight. But she wasn't here to make friends or take the easy route. She was here to ensure accountability and fairness, for the officers and for the community they served. As she flipped through the files, one name caught her attention: Officer Maria Lopez. A recent recruit with a spotless record, Lopez had already shown promise in her short time on the force. Daniels made a mental note to keep an eye on her. She needed allies, officers who believed in the same principles she was fighting for. Outside, Lopez was finishing up a report when her desk phone rang. She picked it up, surprised to hear the chief's calm voice on the other end. "Officer Lopez, can you come to my office?" Lopez's heart raced as she hung up the phone and made her way across the room. She knocked lightly on the door, and Chief Daniels motioned for her to come in. "Take a seat," the chief said, offering a small but genuine smile. Lopez sat, her nerves evident, but her curiosity piqued. "I've been looking over your record," Chief Daniels began. "You've been doing good work here, and I wanted to hear from you directly. How are you finding things so far?" Lopez hesitated, unsure how honest she should be. But something about the chief's tone encouraged her to speak freely. "It's been a bit of an adjustment," she admitted. "I love the work, but sometimes it feels like the rules aren't the same for everyone." Chief Daniels nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's exactly what I'm here to address," she said. "Change isn't easy, and it's going to ruffle some feathers. But I need people like you, officers who are here for the right reasons, to help me make it happen." Lopez felt a surge of pride and responsibility. "I'm in," she said firmly. The chief smiled. "Good, we got a lot of work to do." As Lopez left the office, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, but not everyone in the precinct shared her optimism. In the break room, Officer Daniels sat alone, replaying the morning's events in his mind. His humiliation was compounded by the whispers he could hear as colleagues passed by. He knew his actions had consequences, but the reality of his situation was sinking in harder than he'd expected. Later that day, as Daniels packed up his things to leave, he overheard two officers talking in low voices near the lockers. "She's not going to stop with him," one of them said. "You saw the way she's going through those files. She's going to dig up everything." "What do you expect?" The other replied. "We've been coasting for years. You think that was going to last forever?" Daniels clenched his jaw, his frustration mounting. He felt cornered, like a man whose world was unraveling piece by piece. And as much as he hated to admit it, he was beginning to realize that Chief Daniels wasn't just a temporary problem. She was a force of change, and she wasn't going anywhere. The day ended with a strange quiet settling over the precinct. Officers who had once felt untouchable were now questioning their actions. Some were hopeful, others were resentful, but all of them were waiting to see what would happen next. For Chief Daniels, it was just the beginning. She knew that bringing about real change would require more than just words. It would take action, persistence, and the willingness to face opposition head-on. And as she sat alone in her office that evening, she resolved to do whatever it took to rebuild trust, both within the precinct and with the community they served. But the path ahead was far from clear, and as the shadows grew longer and the precinct empty for the night, one thing was certain: the battle for change had only just begun. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the precinct grew more tense. The once predictable routines had been disrupted, replaced by a sense of unease that seemed to hang in the air like a storm waiting to break. Officers whispered in corners, their conversations growing quieter whenever Chief Daniels walked by. The tension wasn't just about Officer Daniels, it was about the shift in power, the uncertainty of what might come next. Chief Daniels kept her focus sharp. She spent her days meeting with community leaders, reviewing policies, and addressing the long-standing complaints that had been ignored for too long. Each decision she made seemed to send ripples through the precinct, stirring up both hope and resentment. One morning she called a staff meeting. The officers shuffled into the briefing room, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Chief Daniels stood at the front, her posture commanding attention as she waited for the room to settle. "I called this meeting," she began, her voice steady, "because it's time we addressed the issues that have been holding this precinct back. We've lost the trust of the community, and we've lost sight of why we're here. That changes now." The room was silent, but the weight of her words was palpable. "We're implementing new protocols," she continued. "Every complaint will be investigated thoroughly. Accountability starts here. If you're not willing to uphold the standards of this badge, you don't belong here." A murmur spread through the room, some officers nodding in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Chief Daniels didn't flinch. She was prepared for resistance. After the meeting, Officer Daniels approached her, his face pale, but his demeanor more controlled than it had been since their initial confrontation. "Chief," he began hesitantly, "can I speak with you for a moment?" She studied him for a beat before nodding. "Let's talk in my office." Once inside, he stood awkwardly near the door while she took her seat behind the desk. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low but sincere. "What I did, it was wrong. There's no excuse for it." Chief Daniels regarded him carefully. "I appreciate you saying that," she said, her tone measured. "But an apology doesn't erase what happened. It's what you do next that matters." Daniels nodded, looking down at his hands. "I want to make it right. I want to do better." She leaned back, studying him. "If you're serious about that, you'll have to prove it. Actions speak louder than words, Officer Daniels." He left her office with a heavy heart, unsure if he could truly repair the damage he'd done. But he wasn't the only one grappling with the changes. Elsewhere in the precinct, a group of officers had gathered in the break room, their voices low but filled with frustration. Detective Wallace, who had always been careful to stay out of conflicts, found himself drawn into the conversation. "She's going too far," one officer said, his voice bitter. "We've been doing things this way for years. Now she wants to tear it all apart. She's just trying to make a name for herself." Another added, "She doesn't care about us." Wallace frowned but stayed quiet, watching the group closely. He couldn't deny that Chief Daniels' changes were destructive, but he also couldn't ignore the fact that some of the old ways needed to go. As the days turned into weeks, the tension reached a boiling point. The precinct was no longer just a workplace. It had become a battleground. Lines were being drawn, loyalties tested, and the cracks in the system were becoming impossible to ignore. One evening, as the precinct was winding down for the night, Chief Daniels received an anonymous tip. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky but insistent. "There's something you need to know," the caller said. "There are people in your precinct who aren't happy with the changes you're making. They're planning to push back, and it's not going to be pretty." The call ended abruptly, leaving Daniels with more questions than answers. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Who could she trust? How deep did the resistance go? And how far were they willing to go to stop her? She knew the next few days would be critical. The tension was reaching its peak, and whatever was brewing behind the scenes was about to come to light. Chief Daniels steeled herself, knowing that she couldn't back down. Not now, not ever. As the night deepened, the precinct stood quiet, but the unease was undeniable. Something was coming, and it felt like the calm before the storm. The anonymous tip lingered in Chief Daniels' mind long after the call ended. She tried to focus on her work, but the words replayed in her head like a warning she couldn't ignore. Who had called her? And more importantly, what exactly were they trying to tell her? The uncertainty gnawed at her as she scanned the precinct through her office window. Everything looked normal on the surface, but she could sense the tension simmering just below. The next day, Daniels kept her usual calm demeanor, but her eyes were sharper than ever, watching for anything unusual. She noticed subtle changes. Officers whispering more than usual, quiet glances exchanged between certain groups. It was clear that something was happening, but pinpointing it was like trying to catch smoke with her bare hands. By mid-afternoon, she decided it was time to confront the undercurrent of resistance head-on. She called a meeting with her senior staff, including Detective Wallace and Officer Lopez, who had quickly become one of her most trusted allies. The room was small but packed, every seat filled. "I've received information," Daniels began, her voice steady but firm, "that there are individuals within this precinct who are actively working against the changes we're making. Let me be very clear. Resistance to progress is expected, but sabotage is not. If you have concerns, bring them to me, but undermining this precinct's integrity will not be tolerated." The room was silent, save for the faint shuffle of papers as someone shifted nervously. Daniels let her words hang in the air, giving everyone a moment to absorb them. After the meeting, Detective Wallace approached her, his face unreadable. "Chief," he said quietly, "there's something you should know. I've been hearing things about certain officers meeting outside of work hours. They're upset about the new policies, but it's more than that. They're angry, and they feel like you're trying to tear the department apart." Daniels nodded slowly, her suspicions confirmed. "Do you have names?" Wallace hesitated. "Not yet, but I'll find out." As Wallace left her office, Daniels leaned back in her chair, a new layer of unease settling over her. It wasn't just resistance she was facing, it was defiance, potentially from within her own leadership. Later that evening, Daniels stayed late, combing through old reports and disciplinary records. She was determined to find any patterns that might point her in the right direction. Hours passed, and the precinct grew quieter as most of the staff clocked out for the night. Just as she was about to leave, her office phone buzzed. It was Lopez, her voice tense on the other end. "Chief, you need to come to the locker room. Now." Daniels didn't hesitate. She hurried down the dimly lit hallway, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. When she arrived, Lopez was standing near an open locker, her face pale. Inside the locker was a printed photo of Daniels, defaced with crude drawings and words she didn't need to read twice to understand. But what caught her attention most was the note taped beside it. "Go back to where you came from." Daniels stared at the locker for a moment, the weight of the message settling heavily on her chest. She turned to Lopez, who looked as shaken as she felt. "Who does this locker belong to?" Daniels asked, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. Lopez hesitated. "It's Officer Kane's. He's been vocal about not liking the changes." Daniels nodded. "Thank you, Lopez. I'll handle this." As Lopez left, Daniels closed the locker door and leaned against it, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was more than just resistance. It was a blatant act of hostility. And while it didn't scare her, it fueled her resolve. The next morning, Daniels called Officer Kane into her office. He arrived with a smirk that quickly faded when he saw the expression on her face. "Have a seat," she said, her tone icy. Kane sat, crossing his arms defiantly. "What's this about, Chief?" Daniels slid the photo and note across the desk. "Care to explain this?" Kane's face flushed, and his jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Daniels leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "I'm giving you one chance to be honest with me, Officer Kane. 1. If you think this kind of behavior is acceptable, you're sorely mistaken. And if you had anything to do with this, I will find out." Kane shifted in his seat but said nothing. Daniels let the silence stretch, a gaze unrelenting. Finally he muttered, "I didn't do it. But I know some people who aren't happy with how things are going." Daniels nodded, filing his words away for later. "You're dismissed," she said curtly. As Kane left, Daniels felt the walls closing in. The hostility was spreading, and now it was more personal than ever. She had expected resistance, but this level of animosity was something else entirely. That night, as she locked up her office, Daniels felt a strange sense of foreboding. The precinct was nearly empty, the usual hum of activity replaced by an eerie stillness. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming, something that would test her resolve and everything she had worked for. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was here, and was only just beginning. The tension in the precinct reached a fever pitch over the next few days. Chief Daniels moved with purpose, her resolve unwavering despite the mounting hostility. She had spent countless hours piecing together the clues, listening carefully to whispers and reading between the lines of every interaction. The cracks in the precinct's foundation were wider than she'd imagined, and she knew the moment of reckoning was close. Early one morning, Daniels arrived at the precinct before anyone else. The stillness of the empty halls gave her time to think, to plan her next steps. She had scheduled an all-hands meeting later that day, and it wasn't going to be like any meeting they'd had before. This wasn't just about policy changes or community relations. This was about exposing the truth and reclaiming the integrity of her precinct. By the time the officers filed into the briefing room, the air was thick with anticipation. Daniels stood at the front, her posture strong, her expression unreadable. The room fell silent as she began to speak. Over the past few weeks, it's become clear that change isn't just difficult. It's threatening to those who have grown comfortable in a broken system, she said, her voice steady. But I didn't come here to maintain the status quo. I came here to make this precinct better, for everyone. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. Unfortunately, not everyone shares that vision, and some have gone as far as to undermine our efforts to spread division and hostility. The room shifted uneasily. Some officers avoided her gaze, while others looked defiant. Daniels scanned their faces, her sharp eyes taking in every reaction. "And today," she said, her tone sharpening, "we're putting an end to it." She pressed a button on the laptop in front of her, and the projector screen behind her lit up. The room gasped as footage from the precinct's security cameras played, showing a small group of officers, including Officer Kane, meeting in a dark corner of the parking lot after hours. Their conversation, though muffled, was clear enough to reveal their intentions, to resist Daniels' leadership and disrupt her efforts to reform the precinct. The room erupted in murmurs, but Daniels raised her hand, silencing them. "This behavior is unacceptable," she said firmly. It undermines everything we stand for as officers of the law. Effective immediately, those involved will be placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. Kane stood abruptly, his face red with anger. "This is a witch hunt," he shouted. "You're tearing this department apart." Daniels met his gaze without flinching. "No, Officer Kane, you did that yourself." As security escorted Kane and the others from the room, Daniels turned back to the remaining officers. "This is the line in the sand. You're either with me in building a better precinct, or you're not. But make no mistake, this precinct will change, and it will do so with or without you." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling heavily over everyone. Slowly, one by one, officers began nodding, their expressions a mix of resignation and reluctant respect. But just as Daniels began to feel the tide turning, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach drop. It was an alert from the precinct's security system. She quickly excused herself and rushed to her office, her heart pounding. The alert showed an unauthorized access attempt to the precinct's server room. Daniels called Lopez and Wallace, who arrived within minutes, and together they made their way to the server room. Inside, they found Officer Harris standing over a console, his face pale as he realized he'd been caught. "What are you doing, Harris?" Daniels demanded, her voice cold and sharp. Harris stammered, his hands shaking. I wasn't trying to do anything. I swear." Lopez stepped forward, her sharp eyes narrowing. "You've got a flash drive in your hand, Harris. What were you planning to do with it?" Cornered, Harris broke down, his voice trembling as he confessed. "Kane put me up to it. He said if we deleted the complaint records, it would buy us more time, that it would make it harder for you to find anything on us." Daniels shook her head, her expression a mix of disappointment and anger. "You've not only broken the law, Harris, you've betrayed your colleagues and the community we're supposed to serve." Harris was escorted out, and Daniels ordered an immediate review of the server logs to ensure no damage had been done. As the adrenaline began to fade, Daniels felt a sense of resolve harden within her. The corruption ran deeper than she'd anticipated, but she wasn't going to back down. The next day, Daniels called another meeting, this time to address the entire precinct. She stood at the front, her presence commanding, her voice steady. "What happened here wasn't just a failure of a few individuals," she said. "It was a failure of a culture that allowed those individuals to think they could get away with it. That culture ends today." The room was quiet, but Daniels could see the shift in their faces, some hesitant, some relieved, some even hopeful. As the meeting ended, Lopez approached her, a small smile on her face. "You're making a difference, Chief. It's not easy, but it's worth it." Daniels nodded, a rare smile breaking through her serious demeanor. "We're just getting started." But as she returned to her office, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from an unknown number. "You may have won this battle, but the war isn't over." Daniels stared at the screen, her expression unreadable. She locked her phone and sat down, already preparing for the next fight. The storm had passed, but the clouds on the horizon warned her that her work was far from finished. In the days following the text message, Chief Daniels found herself reflecting on the road she had traveled to reach this point. The precinct was quieter now, the undercurrents of hostility mostly silenced after the exposure of Officer Kane and his allies. But there was no denying that the work ahead would be long and arduous. Removing the bad apples was only one step. Rebuilding trust, both within the department and with the community, was an entirely different challenge. Daniels knew she couldn't do it alone. She called a meeting with Lopez and Wallace, her most trusted allies, to discuss the next steps. They sat in her office, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the walls as they brainstormed ideas for moving forward. "We need to focus on transparency," Wallace said, his tone thoughtful. "If the community sees we're serious about change, they'll be more willing to give us a second chance." Lopez nodded in agreement. "And we need to start within. Officers need to know they're being held accountable, but they also need to feel supported. It's a fine line, but it's the only way to fix the culture here." Daniels listened intently, appreciating their insights. "You're both right," she said. "This is about more than just policies. It's about setting a new standard. And that starts now." The first step was implementing a new accountability system. Complaints against officers were now logged publicly, with updates provided as investigations progressed. A community oversight board was established, giving local residents a direct voice in shaping how the precinct operated. Within the department, Daniels introduced a mentorship program, pairing seasoned officers with newer recruits to foster a culture of collaboration and integrity. Training programs were overhauled, emphasizing de-escalation tactics, cultural competency, and ethical decision-making. At first, the changes were met with mixed reactions. Some officers embraced the new direction, eager to be part of something better. Others resisted, their skepticism evident in their attitudes and actions. But over time, as the precinct began to function more smoothly and trust started to rebuild, even the most hesitant officers couldn't deny the progress being made. Daniels also made a point to spend more time in the community. She attended town hall meetings, listened to residents' concerns, and worked to show that the precinct was serious about making amends. The shift wasn't immediate, but slowly people began to approach her with less hostility and more hope. One afternoon, as she walked through the neighborhood, a young girl ran up to her, clutching a notebook and pen. "Are you the police chief?" the girl asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Daniels crouched down to meet her at eye level, smiling warmly. "I am. What's your name?" "Imani," the girl said shyly. "I want to be a police officer when I grow up." Daniels felt a lump rise in her throat. Moments like this reminded her why she had taken this job in the first place. "Imani, I think you'd make a great police officer," she said, "and when you do, I'll be cheering you on." Imani beamed, and her mother, standing nearby, gave Daniels a nod of appreciation. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that change, though slow, was possible. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was beginning to feel different. Officers who had once been skeptical of Daniels' leadership now greeted her with respect. The murmurs of discontent had faded, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of unity. One evening, Lopez knocked on Daniels' office door, holding a file in her hand. "Chief, you're going to want to see this," she said, handing over the document. Daniels opened it to find a detailed report on Officer Harris, who had been implicated in the server room incident. To her surprise, the report included a handwritten letter from Harris himself, apologizing for his actions and requesting a chance to make things right. "He's been attending counseling sessions and volunteering with community programs," Lopez explained. "He's trying to turn things around." Daniels considered the file carefully. She believed in second chances, but only when they were earned. "Keep an eye on him," she said. "If he's serious, he might still have a place here. But the moment he slips, he's out." Lopez nodded, understanding the gravity of the decision. As the weeks turned into months, the precincts slowly transformed. Daniels continued to face challenges, but with each small victory, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. The community began to trust her leadership, and officers started to believe in the vision she had laid out for them. One day, as she stood outside the precinct watching officers interact with neighborhood kids during a community event, Daniels felt a rare sense of peace. The battle had been hard fought, and there was still much to do, but for the first time, she felt like they were on the right path. That evening, as she returned to her office, she found an envelope on her desk with no name on it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the words, "You've won this round, but we're still watching." Daniels stared at the note, her jaw tightening. She knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be those who resisted progress, but she also knew she had the strength, the support, and the determination to keep going. She placed the note in her desk drawer and looked out the window at the precinct, bustling with activity. For the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. The storm had passed, and though the skies were not entirely clear, the light breaking through was enough to guide her forward.